The stranger paid her debt and asked for nothing. Then she found out who he really was. Before you find out what happens next, I invite you to stay with me until the very end of this story. Hit that like button and drop the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far this tale travels. The cost of keeping. The dead don't answer. But Eliza Cole talked to them anyway. She had been standing at the iron fence for 20 minutes, long enough for the morning cold to work through her coat and settle into her bones, long enough for the sun to crest the ridge and turn the sky above Socorro, a color like ash, trying to become gold. 2 headstones, side by side, the way they had always been in life. 6 months apart. Her father first, then her mother, as if Margaret had simply looked at the world without him in it, and decided the arithmetic didn't add up. "Today's the day," Eliza said to them. Her voice came out flat and dry, the way everything in New Mexico came out in October, wrung of moisture stripped to its bare shape. "The bank's coming this morning. Hastings himself, I expect. With his ledger and his deputy and that look he gets like he's doing you a kindness by taking everything." The wind moved through the cedar tree her father had planted the year she was born. It made a sound like something breathing. "I tried," she said. "I want you to know that. 4 months I tried. I sold the wagon team. I sold Mama's silver candlesticks, the ones her mother brought from Tennessee. I sold the old breeding records to a man in Albuquerque who wanted the bloodline documentation." She paused. "I don't know if that was wrong. Selling the records. It felt like selling part of you, Papa. But I needed the money, and I thought maybe just the records could go, if it meant keeping the horses." It hadn't been enough. The drought had seen to that, and the cattle disease that swept through in August and took 11 of their best animals. And the interest the bank kept tacking onto the original debt, like barnacles, small additions that added up over months until the number felt designed to be impossible. $2,300. That was the cost of her father's last gamble. The expansion loan he'd taken to grow the breeding operation, the one that would have paid off brilliantly if he'd lived another 2 years to see it through. He hadn't lived another 2 years. He had lived another 14 months, and then a horse he'd gentled himself a roan mare, named Patience of all things, had spooked at a rattlesnake on the North Ridge, and put Thomas Cole's head against a rock at exactly the wrong angle. He had been dead before Eliza reached him. "I'm sorry," she said to the stones. "I'm sorry I couldn't finish what you started." She stood there a moment longer, memorizing the way the light fell across the ridge, the way the ranch looked from this hill, the house her father had built board by board, the barn with its weather vane shaped like a running horse, the pastures where 8 mares moved in the early morning, cool their breath making small ghosts in the air. She was memorizing it, because after today, she might not be standing here again as its owner. Then she turned and walked down the hill. She had things to do before the bank arrived. The morning had the quality of a held breath. Eliza worked through the horse stalls mechanically, muscle memory, carrying her hands through the familiar motions of feeding and watering, while her mind stayed somewhere else entirely. Ranger, her father's prize stallion, the Kentucky thoroughbred that had cost Thomas Cole nearly every dollar he'd saved over 3 years, pushed his great head against her shoulder as she poured his grain, and she stood still for a moment with her face pressed to his neck, breathing in the smell of horse and hay, and something that had no name, but meant home. "They'll sell you," she said into his mane. "Someone will buy you for less than you're worth, and put you to work pulling a plow somewhere, and you'll never know what you were supposed to be." Ranger made no answer. He ate his grain with the dignified patience of an animal that had never known any world but this one. By 7 o'clock the horses were fed, the morning chores were done, and Eliza was standing at the kitchen window with her father's coffee cup in her hands. His cup, the one with the hairline crack along the handle that she'd never repaired, because throwing it away felt worse than the inconvenience of the crack. The foreclosure notice was still on the kitchen table, face down. She didn't turn it over. She had read it enough times that the words had worn grooves in her memory. Final notice. Amount due $2,300. Failure to remit payment by October 15th will result in immediate seizure of property and assets. October 15th. Today. She heard them before she saw them. Wagon wheels on the dry road, moving with the unhurried confidence of people who know they have the law on their side. She set down her father's cup carefully on the shelf where he had always kept it, and went out to the porch. 2 carriages, black as a preacher's coat with the Territorial Bank's seal, painted on the side in gold that caught the morning sun. 4 men climbing down 3 she didn't recognize in city suits that had no business in this heat, and one she knew. Vernon Hastings. He had been managing the Socorro branch of the Territorial Bank since before Eliza was born. He had shaken her father's hand at the 4th of July celebrations every year. He had eaten Margaret Cole's pie at the church socials and said it was the best he'd ever tasted. He had a wife named Clara and 2 daughters in school and a house on the good side of town, and he had the kind of face that was always doing something slightly different from what it appeared to be doing. He approached the porch with his hat in his hand, in a gesture that might have been respect if she didn't know better. "Miss Cole?" His voice carried the particular gentleness of a man who has learned that being kind during cruelty costs him nothing. "I'm sorry it's come to this." "Are you?" Eliza's voice came out steadier than she'd expected. She stood at the top of the steps with her hands clasped in front of her, and she looked at Vernon Hastings and she did not move. Something flickered across his face. "Your father was a valued customer for many years. The bank extended him credit in good faith. The bank extended him a loan," Eliza said. "He put up his land as collateral because he trusted that a drought and a cattle disease happening in the same year was unlikely. He was wrong about that. It doesn't change what this land is." Hastings spread his hands. The gesture said, "I am reasonable. I am helpless. The world is what it is." "Miss Cole, the total amount owed including accumulated interest and fees stands at $2,300. Do you have that sum?" The question hung in the morning air like smoke. "You know I don't," Eliza said. "Then I'm afraid we have no choice." He gestured to the men behind him. "Mr. Pembroke is our assessor. He'll catalog the property and assets. I'll need you to vacate the premises by sundown." Vacate. Such a clean word for such a brutal thing. "The horses," Eliza said. Her voice caught on something, and she forced it smooth. "The horses are separate from the ranch operation. My father kept independent records for the breeding stock. Everything on this property is collateral, Miss Cole." Hastings' voice was not unkind, which was somehow worse. "The horses, the cattle, the equipment. All of it will be sold at auction to satisfy the debt." Pembroke, a small man with the eyes of an accountant, and the conscience of one too, was already moving toward the barn with his leather-bound ledger open. The deputy who had come with them positioned himself near the carriages, hand resting on his gun belt, with the bored ease of a man who had done this before and expected to do it again. "Where am I supposed to go?" Eliza asked. The words tasted like surrender, and she hated herself for asking, and she asked anyway. "That is not the bank's concern," Hastings said. There it was, the true face of it underneath the condolences and the reasonable voice. Not cruelty exactly, something worse. Indifference. She and everything she'd ever known were a line item in a ledger, and the line item was being closed, and that was all. Eliza stepped aside. Let them climb the porch steps. Let them move through her house with their pencils and their leather notebooks. She stood in the yard and watched Pembroke walk into her father's barn, and she let the enormity of it pass through her without fighting it, because fighting a wave that size only drowned you faster. She found herself walking uphill without deciding to. When she reached the iron fence, she didn't go inside. She just stood at the gate and looked at the 2 stones and thought, so this is how it ends. Not with a fight, with paperwork. "Miss Cole." Hastings' voice sharp across the yard. "I need you back at the house." She went back. They were halfway through the inventory when Eliza signed the papers Hastings put in front of her. Her hand shook on the first signature. By the third, it had stopped. There was something almost peaceful about the moment your last option was gone. All the anxious, searching for alternatives quieted because there was nothing left to search for. Eliza Jane Cole, 3 times, each one a small door closing. Preliminary figures put the total asset value at approximately $1,800, Pembroke announced, consulting his ledger without looking up. Accounting for the condition of structures, livestock, and current market conditions. $1,800 for 30 years of her father's life, for the stallion that was worth twice that alone if sold to the right buyer. "That will barely cover the principal," Hastings said, as if this was news to him. As if he hadn't known exactly how this arithmetic would work out when he approved the terms of the original loan. Eliza stood in the yard in the October heat and looked at nothing, and waited for whatever came next. What came next arrived at a gallop. She heard the hoofbeats, first a horse moving fast, not the careful pace of someone making a social call, but the purposeful thunder of someone who has somewhere to be and intends to get there. Everyone turned. Down the long drive, dust billowing up behind a bay gelding, came a rider pushing hard. He didn't slow as he approached. If anything, he pushed faster, and for one strange moment Eliza thought he might not stop at all, might just ride straight through the tableau of her dispossession, like it wasn't happening. Then he hauled back on the reins 10 yards out the bay, sliding to a stop in a spray of gravel, and swung down from the saddle, before the horse had fully stilled. Tall, broad through the shoulders, a weathered canvas duster the color of old wood. He moved with the particular economy of someone who had spent so many years on horseback that dismounting was just falling with intention. His face, when he turned toward them, was younger than his bearing suggested. Early 30s, she thought, with sun-darkened skin and several days' worth of beard and eyes the color of rain over stone. He looked at Hastings. Then his eyes found Eliza, and something shifted in them. Recognition, maybe, or something more complicated than recognition. "Are you Eliza Cole?" he asked. His voice was deep with the faint trace of an accent that suggested Spanish had come before English. "I am." She studied his face and found nothing familiar in it. "Do I know you?" "No, ma'am." His gaze moved over the carriages over Hastings and Pembroke and the deputy, and something tightened in his jaw. "Is this a foreclosure?" "That is none of your concern," Hastings said, with the stiff dignity of a man who has just had his authority questioned by someone he didn't invite. "This is bank business. I'm making it my concern." The stranger's hand rested near his gun belt, not threateningly, but noticeably the way a man's hand rests on something he's comfortable with. He looked at Eliza. "These men are taking your ranch." She heard herself answer, as if from a slight distance. "I owe the bank money. $2,300. I don't have it." He was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. She would remember those 3 seconds for the rest of her life, the way time seemed to develop a different texture, like the air before lightning. "If the debt were paid in full right now," he said to Hastings, "the foreclosure would stop." Hastings blinked. The expression on his face moved through several stages of confusion before settling on a careful blankness. If the total amount owed were remitted in full, yes, as the foreclosure proceedings would be suspended. "But Mr. Reeves," the stranger said. "Caleb Reeves." He was already reaching into his saddlebag. "How much exactly with all the fees?" $2,300. "But I must advise you that this is highly—" Caleb Reeves pulled out a leather pouch, then a second one, both heavy enough to make a sound like money when he set them on the running board of the nearest carriage. "Count it," he said to Pembroke. Pembroke stared at the pouches the way a man stares at something that has just violated his understanding of the probable. Hastings moved forward, his careful neutrality cracking at the edges. "This is where did you—" "It's legal currency. Count it." With hands that weren't entirely steady, Pembroke began sorting coins into stacks. Gold, most of it with some silver. The stacks grew in the October sun. 1,000. A second pouch. 2,000. A third, smaller pouch from Reeves's vest pocket. That should cover the principal plus fees, Reeves said. And then some. The final count was $2,360. Hastings looked at the money, the way a man looks at something that has beaten him at his own game. The expression lasted only a moment before he recovered himself. "Mr. Reeves, I must advise you that by paying Miss Cole's debt, you don't gain any automatic claim to the property. The debt would simply be, I understand how debt works." There was no anger in Reeves' voice, just the flat certainty of a man who has already accounted for every objection. "Write up your papers confirming payment. Miss Cole and I will handle the rest between ourselves." Eliza found her voice. "I don't what is happening." Reeves turned to her, and something in his expression changed. The edge that had been directed at Hastings softened into something less certain. "What's happening is these men are leaving," he said, "and you're keeping your ranch. But why? I'll explain after they're gone." It took another 30 minutes for Hastings to produce a receipt written and signed at Reeves's insistence before any of the money left the running board. Reeves read it twice before folding it into his coat pocket. His eyes moved over every word with the attention of someone who had learned not to trust printed promises without examining them. "This certifies that the debt of $2,300 owed by Miss Eliza Jane Cole to the Territorial Bank of New Mexico has been paid in full on this date, October 15, 1886. When the carriages finally rolled back down the drive, Eliza stood in the yard and watched them until the dust settled, and there was nothing left to watch. The morning felt strangely empty. The weight she'd been carrying for 4 months hadn't gone. It had changed shape into something she didn't have a name for yet. She turned to the man who had just rearranged her life. Caleb Reeves was watching her with those gray eyes. Up close, she could see that he was tired, the kind of tired that came from riding through the night, not just the ordinary tiredness of a working day. "You said you'd explain," she said. "I did." He glanced toward the house. "Might be better done out of the sun. I've been riding since before dark." The kitchen felt strange with a stranger in it. Eliza made coffee because it was the thing she knew how to do when she didn't know what to do, and because having something in her hands kept them from shaking. Caleb Reeves sat at her kitchen table. Her father's chair, she noticed, and then made herself stop noticing, and removed his hat, and set it on his knee and looked at the room with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a place. "You've seen me before," she said her back to him as she worked at the stove. "You knew my name." "I have. Seen you in town a few times over this past year. Once at the feed store. Once at the 4th of July social." She had a vague memory of that day, one of the last normal days before the weight of everything had made normal feel impossible. She didn't remember seeing him. "I didn't notice you," she said. "Most people don't. I don't tend to make myself noticed." She poured 2 cups, set one in front of him, and sat down across the table. He was watching her with an expression that was difficult to read, not unkind, but guarded in the way of someone who has learned that openness has costs. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do that? You spent $2,300 for someone you've never spoken to." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I had the money. I've been saving it for years looking for land to buy. Good land is hard to come by in this territory. There's always someone with more money or better connections who gets there first." "So you want to buy my ranch?" "No." The answer came quickly enough to be genuine. "I want to make you an offer, if you're willing to hear it." "I'm listening." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup and looked at it for a moment before he spoke. "I've been driving cattle for 12 years. Started when I was 18, working outfits in Texas and Colorado. Spent every season on the trail. Saved every dollar I didn't need for basics. He paused. I know cattle. I know range management water rights breeding programs, what markets pay, and when and why. What I don't know, he glanced up at her, is horses. Not the way you know them. What are you offering? Partnership. Equal, 50-50 ownership of the ranch and everything on it. I put in the capital I've been saving. There's more where that 2,000 came from. You contribute the land, the existing stock, and your knowledge of the horse breeding program. We run this place together. Share the profits, share the risk, share the work. Eliza sat with that for a moment. You want to go into business with someone you don't know, she said. I know enough. His voice was steady. I know you didn't quit when your parents died. I know you fought for 4 months to save this place when most people would have given up in 2. I know you stood on that porch this morning and faced down those bankmen with nothing in your hand but your name. He paused. That tells me what I need to know. It doesn't tell you whether I can run a profitable operation. No, but this does. He reached into his coat and produced a leather portfolio, set it on the table, and pushed it toward her. Bank statements, letters of credit, inventory of livestock I have in Colorado. I paid winter grazing fees before I came here. Take your time. She opened the portfolio. The numbers surprised her. After paying her debt, Caleb Reeves had nearly $4,000 in accessible capital, and cattle worth at least that much again in the current market. The letter from the Colorado outfit's foreman was matter-of-fact and specific. 300 head mixed breeds in good condition held on winter grazing per Mr. Reeves' arrangements. He had been planning this, not necessarily this specific moment, but the general shape of it. He had money put aside, not for a frivolous purchase, but for something he had been thinking about for years. You've been saving since you were 18, she said. Every dollar I didn't need for basics. Figured eventually I'd have enough to buy land outright. Something shifted in his expression. But land that's already been worked, land that has something built on it that's worth more than raw acreage. What your father built here is worth saving. What happens if I say no? He considered the question with the same steadiness he seemed to bring to everything. Then the debt is paid, and you have breathing room to find another way forward. I'll head on. You just walk away, after spending $2,300. Consider it an investment in doing the right thing, he said. Sometimes that has to be enough. Eliza looked at him across her father's kitchen table, this stranger with his tired gray eyes and his saddlebag full of gold, and tried to take the measure of him. She was good at horses, at reading the particular combination of temperament and history that made an animal what it was. She was less practiced at reading people. Her father had been better at it. What would you see, Papa? She thought. She closed the portfolio. I need until tomorrow, she said, to think about this properly, not just react to almost losing everything. That's wise. He stood reaching for his hat. I'll head into town, get a room at the boarding house. Come back tomorrow morning. And if I say yes, then we ride into town together and see a lawyer. He was halfway to the door when something made her call after him. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the portfolio and the years it represented. Maybe it was something in the way he had read that receipt twice before he trusted it. Mr. Reeves. He stopped, didn't turn immediately, just paused the way a man does who has learned to be careful about which direction he faces when he doesn't know what's coming. How long have you been planning this? He did turn, then, and something crossed his face that was too complicated to name in the moment she saw it. Not guilt exactly, but something in the family of guilt. Something that knew it was in the presence of a question it hadn't fully prepared for. About 2 months, he said. Since I heard in town you were behind on payments. She nodded slowly. There was more to that answer, she sensed. More that he had chosen not to include. But he had given her enough truth for one day, and she had enough to sit with already. Tomorrow morning, she said. He touched the brim of his hat and walked out into the October afternoon. Eliza did not sleep. She went through her father's study instead, spreading his papers across the desk and working through them by lamplight until well past midnight. The breeding records, the loan documents, the correspondence with buyers across 3 territories. She had looked at these papers 100 times in the past 4 months. But she looked at them differently now, not as evidence of how much she had to save, but as documentation of what she was being asked to share. 30 years of careful work. Her father's handwriting in the margins of the breeding records, noting the qualities of each mare and stallion, tracking which bloodline combinations produced the best results. The math of it was patient and long-term, the kind of thinking that didn't pay off for years, but paid off enormously when it did. She had been trying to carry all of this alone. The breeding program, the cattle, the repairs, the debt payments, the drought management, the slow docking of everything her father had built one asset at a time. I can't do this alone, she admitted to herself at some point in the small hours when the lamp was burning low. I've known that for months. I just didn't want to say it out loud because saying it felt like failing. But was that true? Was admitting you couldn't do everything alone the same as failing? Or was it just accurate? Her mother had been quiet and capable and devoted entirely to the family, and Eliza had loved her completely, but she had also watched her mother shrink over the years, had watched Margaret Cole become smaller and smaller in proportion to her husband, until by the end, she had been so thoroughly defined by her relationship to Thomas that when he died, there had been almost nothing left of her to hold on. Margaret Cole had been gone within 2 months of her husband, and Eliza had understood in the cold, clear way of grief that her mother had not really known how to be a person without him. Eliza had sworn she would never be that. Would never reduce herself to someone's reflection. But this, what Reeves was offering this, wasn't that. He wasn't asking her to become his reflection. He was asking to become her partner. Equal ownership, equal decision-making, different expertise combined. That was a different thing. She fell asleep at the desk some time before dawn and woke with her face on her father's breeding records and the lamp guttered out and the first pale light coming through the window. She sat up, rubbed her eyes, looked at the papers spread under her hands. Her answer had been the same all night. She just hadn't been willing to say it yet. He came with the sunrise. She heard his horse while she was finishing the morning feeding the bay gelding's hoofbeats, distinctive. Now she had already learned the rhythm of his horse without realizing she was learning it. By the time she walked out of the barn with a water bucket in each hand, he was riding in through the gate, and the morning light was behind him, and he looked like something out of the old stories her father used to tell about the territory before it was tamed. He pulled up near the porch and swung down, and the first thing he did was look at her, not at the ranch, not at the barn, not at the horizon, at her. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She set down the buckets and wiped her hands on her skirt. "You're early. Didn't want to waste daylight, if you'd made up your mind." He paused, and she could see the careful tension in his stillness. "Have you?" "Yes." She took a breath. "My answer is yes." Something in him settled. A breath released a held thing, let go. "You're certain?" "I have plenty of second thoughts. The first thought keeps winning." She looked at him steadily. "I can't do this alone, and you're offering a fair solution. More than fair considering you already paid the debt with no guarantee I'd accept." He nodded once. "Then we should head into town. Get the legal work started. Let me saddle a horse. We could take the wagon. We'll need to transport documents. Hastings told me the wagon was part of the ranch assets." She said it flatly. He was lying. "The wagon's mine. I just didn't want to argue with him about every last thing." For the first time, she saw something like a smile at the corner of Caleb Reeves's mouth. Smart. Pick your battles. They hitched the wagon in the early morning cool, working side by side, in the way of people who have not yet established the choreography of shared tasks, and are still figuring out who moves where. Twice their hands came close to the same piece of harness, and twice one of them redirected without comment. It was careful. It was new. It was the beginning of something, though neither of them said so. The road to Socorro ran 12 miles through land that had dried and cracked and reassembled itself under the weight of the drought into something gaunt and angular like a man who had lost too much weight. The October light was hard and flat and honest about everything. "Tell me about the horses," Caleb said after they had driven in silence long enough that the silence had become comfortable. "Your father's breeding program. What was his vision?" She had expected questions about the finances or the infrastructure. Not this. He wanted to develop a line that combined the endurance of Mustang stock with the size and strength of a thoroughbred, she said. Working horses that could go all day in harsh conditions, but still had the speed and temperament for ranch work. He'd been at it 15 years, carefully selecting bloodlines. "Ranger is your foundation stallion. Papa bought him from a breeder in Kentucky. Cost him nearly everything he had saved at the time. But he said the moment he saw that horse..." She paused, because the memory of her father saying this was still close enough to hurt. He said Ranger had the conformation he'd been dreaming of. Said you could see what his grandsons would look like in the way he moved. The 2 pregnant mares. First-generation Ranger foals if they throw true. Those babies will be the proof of concept Papa was working toward. She looked out at the passing landscape. He never got to see them. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Then we have a reason to make sure they arrive safely." It was a small thing to say, but it landed somewhere precise in her chest, the acknowledgement that the work mattered, that the vision was worth continuing, that she wasn't the only one who saw the point of it. "What about your cattle?" she asked. "You said 300 head in Colorado. Mixed breeds, mostly Herefords for the beef quality, some Longhorns for the hardiness. They're with an outfit I worked for last season. I paid winter grazing fees before I came." He thought for a moment. "Come spring, I can either sell most of them and use the capital here, or we can drive a portion down to New Mexico if we've got the range. The arroyo pasture could support 100 head, maybe more with proper rotation." She was thinking through it as she spoke, running the numbers. "The key is not to overgraze. That's how you kill land, permanently." "Agreed. We start modest. Build up the herd slowly while the horse operation develops. One can carry the ranch when the other has a slow year." She glanced at him sideways. "My father thought about doing that. Diversifying. He was so close to the horse program being profitable that he kept putting off the cattle expansion." "He put too many eggs in one basket," Caleb said. Not unkindly. "Yes." She paused. "He was brave about it, though. He believed in what he was building." "That comes through. In the records. In the ranch." They drove in silence for a while. Socorro appeared ahead of them on the flat rising out of the landscape, in its adobe and timber solidity, the church steeple catching the morning light. Eliza was thinking about the question she hadn't asked yet. She had been saving it, testing the weight of it, deciding whether it mattered, or whether she was looking for reasons to be suspicious. But she had her father's instinct for details, and details had a way of becoming important. "Mr. Reeves," she said. "Caleb." Caleb. The name was new in her mouth. "There's something I want to ask you." "All right." She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a folded paper, a document she had found late in the night while going through her father's correspondence files. It was old. The creases had gone soft. She unfolded it and held it where he could see it without taking his eyes too far from the road. "My father kept records of every official who came to the ranch," she said. "For any reason. Inspections. Water rights assessments, anything that required documentation." She paused. This is from a water rights survey 1882. The assessor's signature at the bottom. She watched his face. She watched his hands tighten fractionally on the reins. Caleb Reeves, Territorial Bank of New Mexico, assessor. The silence stretched out for 5 seconds to 15. The wagon wheels found a rut in the road and lurched. "You worked for the bank," Eliza said. Her voice was steady. "4 years ago, you assessed properties." "Yes." No hesitation, no excuse. "For foreclosures." Another pause, barely long enough to measure. "Sometimes." She folded the paper and put it back in her pocket. Her hands were steady. Her chest was not. "And you didn't think to mention this?" "I was going to." He kept his eyes on the road. "I was trying to figure out the right moment." "There isn't a right moment for something like that. There's just telling me and not telling me." He let that sit. After a while, "You're right. Is that why you know how the bank processes work? How to demand a receipt? What language to put in it?" "Yes." "Is there anything else I should know?" The road ran on ahead of them. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled on a thermal. Caleb Reeves looked at the road, and she looked at his profile and waited. "Yes," he said. "But not yet. Some things need the right ground before they can be laid down." It was not the answer she wanted. It was, she acknowledged, the honest answer. The answer of a man who was not going to pretend to have no complications, but who was asking for time to give those complications their proper shape. She faced forward. "Then you have time," she said, "but not unlimited time." Understood. Judge Socorro materialized around them. The streets were busy with the morning commerce of a territory town. Merchants, ranchers, children running errands, women with baskets. Eliza felt the eyes follow the wagon, felt the particular attention of a small town for a familiar face in unfamiliar company. Let them look. The lawyer's office was on a side street, near the courthouse. Arthur Peaton, attorney at law. Small, tidy shelves full of legal volumes, a desk buried in papers, a man in his 50s with spectacles, and the measured movements of someone accustomed to weighing his words carefully. He looked up when they came in. "Miss Cole," he said, "I know of your situation. I'm sorry for your losses." He looked at Caleb. "And you are?" "Caleb Reeves. I'm here to establish a business partnership with Miss Cole for the operation of the Cole Ranch." Peaton's eyebrows rose slightly. He gestured to the chairs. "Please sit. Tell me what you have in mind." Then for the next hour, they built the architecture of their shared future in legal language. Peaton asked careful questions, made careful notes, pushed back twice when the terms seemed to favor one party over the other, and satisfied himself before he moved on. He was thorough in the way of a man who had seen enough partnerships go wrong to know where the faults usually ran. "Miss Cole." He looked at her over his spectacles. "You understand that by entering this partnership, you're giving Mr. Reeves half ownership of property that has been in your family for 30 years. "I do." "And you're comfortable with that arrangement?" She looked at Caleb across the desk. He met her eyes, and there was no flinching in his. "Without him, I'd have nothing," she said. "With him, I have a chance to keep my father's ranch running and make it into what he meant it to be." "Yes, I'm comfortable." Peaton turned to Caleb. "And you're putting significant capital into a property you've never worked with a partner you barely know." "I know what I need to know," Caleb said. "I've reviewed the breeding records and the land. The fundamentals are sound. What was lacking was working capital and labor, both of which I can provide." The lawyer studied them both for a long, quiet moment. Then he nodded. "I'll have the papers ready in 3 days. Come back Thursday to sign. In the meantime—" He looked at them with the mild expression of a man making an observation he considers unnecessary, but is going to make anyway. "Think carefully about what you're agreeing to. Partnerships succeed or fail on communication, not capital. "We'll manage," Eliza said. They walked out into the Socorro morning, and the sun was higher now, and the town moved around them, and they stood for a moment on the sidewalk, not quite looking at each other. "General store," Caleb said. "If we're going to start working the ranch properly, we need supplies. I don't have much cash." "I do. Consider it an advance on partnership expenses." Inside the general store, they drew stares and collected at least one pointed comment delivered in the form of excessive politeness from Mrs. Henderson, who managed the counter with the focused curiosity of someone gathering material. Eliza bought what the ranch needed. Caleb added a new axe, a coil of good rope, and a set of shingle nails without being asked. On the way back to the wagon, Margaret Sullivan, a woman Eliza had known since childhood, intercepted them on the sidewalk with bright eyes and an agenda visible from 30 yards. "Eliza Cole, I heard the most extraordinary rumor about the bank. The debt's been paid," Eliza said. "Margaret, this is Caleb Reeves. He's going to be my business partner." Yet Margaret's gaze moved between them with the speed of a woman who had spent years refining the skill of rapid assessment. "Business partner," she repeated in a tone that suggested she considered the term provisional. "Legal papers are being drawn up as we speak," Eliza said. "We'll be running the ranch together." "How very," Margaret searched for the word, "modern of you." "Good day, Margaret." In the wagon heading home, Caleb said dryly, "That went about as expected." "It's going to be like that for a while," Eliza said. "People will talk. Let them." He guided the horse around a rut in the road. "Once they see how hard we're working, they'll find something more interesting to gossip about." She hoped he was right, but she was already thinking about something else. About the folded paper in her coat pocket. About the 4 years between 1882 and now, and what a man who had once assessed properties for a bank did in those years that turned him into someone who would spend his savings to stop a foreclosure. About what he had said on the road. Some things need the right ground before they can be laid down. She was going to find out what he was carrying. Whatever the ground required. She was going to find out. What partners carry. The partnership papers were signed on a Thursday. Eliza wrote her name twice once on each copy and watched Caleb do the same, and when it was done, the lawyer witnessed both signatures and shook their hands and said he hoped they knew what they were getting into. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to them all week. Outside on the Socorro sidewalk, Eliza stood with her copy of the agreement folded in her coat pocket and tried to identify what she was feeling. Not fear. Something adjacent to it, but different. The feeling of stepping off the last solid ground before a river crossing the kind of feeling that was its own kind of courage, because you stepped anyway. Caleb stood beside her, squinting at the street. "We should get back. Tom Briggs is delivering a load of fence posts this afternoon. You hired someone without telling me. I asked around about fence suppliers. He came recommended." He glanced at her. "I should have mentioned it." "Yes, you should have." She said it without heat. They were still learning the edges of their arrangement, still mapping where consultation was required and where individual action was acceptable. "Going forward, anything that involves the ranch we discuss first." Agreed. No defensiveness, just acknowledgement. That was one of the things she was learning about him. He didn't spend energy defending positions that didn't need defending. When he was wrong, he said so, and moved forward. It was a quality that made things easier between them in practical terms, and more complicated in the terms she was still trying to name. They drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon light, and when they arrived, a lean, gray-haired man was waiting with a wagon full of cedar posts and an expression that suggested he'd been there long enough to form an opinion of the place. Tom Briggs, 60 years in cattle country, showed in the economy of his movements and the permanent squint from a lifetime of looking at horizons. He nodded at Eliza with the respect of a man who had worked for women before and found no particular difficulty in it, and he shook Caleb's hand with the specific firmness of men who had worked the same country and were establishing that they knew it. "Good land," he said, looking out at the ranch. "Needs water." "Everything in New Mexico needs water," Caleb said. "The Arroyo Spring is deep," Eliza said. "My father had it surveyed. Even in drought years it keeps running. That's why he chose this land." Briggs nodded, like this was the right answer. "Then you've got what you need. Rest is work." He was right. The rest was work. The days that followed had the quality of something being built slowly board by board, in conditions that were not ideal, but were what they had. Caleb tackled the fence line in the eastern pasture, while Eliza managed the horses and handled the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch from falling apart. They ate meals together at the kitchen table and discussed the next day's priorities, and gradually, without ceremony, became people who knew how the other moved through a morning. She learned he woke before her and had the coffee going by the time she came downstairs. She learned he was meticulous about tools, every implement cleaned, and returned to its place at the end of the day. She learned that he had strong opinions about fence post spacing that were based on 17 years of watching what happened when posts were set too shallow, and that once he had an opinion about something structural, he held it with a quiet, immovable certainty that made arguing about it feel like arguing with a boulder. He learned she could read a horse the way other people read text, something in the set of an animal's ears. The particular quality of its attention told her more than she could fully explain. He learned she kept her father's breeding records with a devotion that was almost religious. He learned that when something frightened her, she got very still and very controlled, and the controlling was the tell. He was still carrying something he hadn't told her. She could see it. The way you see something moving under still water, the shape of it was there if you looked at the right angle. She let him carry it. For now. 11 days after they signed the papers, a man came to the ranch. He arrived in the early afternoon in a private carriage. Not the bank's black conveyances, but something more expensive. Dark red lacquer and brass fittings. The kind of vehicle that announced its owner's finances before a word was spoken. He was perhaps 55, with the kind of physical largeness that had once been muscle, and was now something heavier, and he wore his expensive clothes with the ease of a man who had been rich long enough to forget that other conditions existed. Harlan Briggs, no relation to the fence supplier, she would later confirm. He introduced himself at the porch steps with the cordiality of a man who considered cordiality a tool. He had the eyes Eliza thought of someone who assessed the worth of everything he looked at, and found most of it wanting. "Miss Cole," he said. "Or is it Miss Cole and Mr. Reeves? Now I've heard you've taken on a partner." "News travels," she said. "What can I do for you?" "I'm the one who can do something for you, I think." He produced a card and presented it as if handing her a gift. Harlan T. Briggs, Land Development and Commercial Interests, Denver. I represent a consortium with significant interests in the development of the New Mexico territory. We're acquiring land along a particular corridor very quietly, very generously, to support a commercial infrastructure project. What kind of project? I'm not at liberty to discuss the specifics at this stage. What I can tell you is that the price we're prepared to offer for this property is considerably more than its current market value. Eliza heard the boards of the porch creak behind her. She didn't look back, but she knew without looking that Caleb had come out of the house. "This property isn't for sale," she said. Briggs smiled. The smile didn't alter anything in the area around his eyes. "Miss Cole, I understand there's sentiment involved. Your family has been here for decades, but sentiment is a poor basis for financial decisions." He glanced at the ranch, the sagging fence line, the barn roof with its patch of new shingles still pale against the weathered old ones. "This operation has had a difficult year, perhaps several difficult years ahead. The offer I'm prepared to make would give you the means to start fresh somewhere more, a slight pause. Promising." "The ranch stays," Eliza said. "I appreciate your time." Another smile. This one with something underneath it she didn't like. "Of course," Think it over. The offer stands for 60 days. He tipped his hat. Mr. Reeves. He turned and walked back to his carriage. She watched him go. When his carriage had disappeared down the drive, Caleb said from just behind her right shoulder, "You know who that is. Harlan Briggs, land developer out of Denver. Do you know what he's building?" She turned. His face was carefully neutral in a way that was itself informative. "Tell me." He was quiet for 3 seconds. 2, 1. "A railroad," he said. "A spur line to connect Socorro to the main trunk. The corridor runs through this valley." He paused. "Your ranch sits in the middle of it." "How do you know this?" Another pause. Longer this time. The wind moved through the yard and took some dust with it. "Because," Caleb said, "2 years ago I was working for him." The kitchen again. The table between them like a border. Eliza poured coffee she didn't want and sat down and looked at her partner across the familiar wood and waited. "I left the bank in 1883, Caleb said. He had his hands flat on the table, not wrapped around his cup, the posture of a man presenting himself for examination. "Couldn't keep doing what I was doing there. The assessing. You saw the water rights survey from '82. That was one of the easier ones." "What were the harder ones?" He met her eyes. "Properties. Like yours. Walking through someone's home with a ledger and writing down the numbers that would be used to take it from them." He paused. "I was good at it. The bank liked me because I was thorough, and I didn't let things become personal." A slight movement of his jaw. "Until they did." "Your mother," Eliza said. Something shifted in his face. "She had a farm outside of Taos. My father died the winter of '81. She tried to keep it running. She didn't know the business side he'd handled all of that. Within a year, she was in arrears." He looked at the table. "The bank sent me, because she was in my district." The silence in the kitchen was total. Outside, somewhere in the distance, Ranger called to one of the mares, and the sound of it was lonely in the way that only a horse's voice can be lonely. "You assessed your own mother's property," Eliza said, "and signed the paperwork." He said it flat, factual, the way you say things that have had time to become scar tissue. "She didn't know what I was there for until I handed her the documents. She thought I was visiting." He was still for a moment. "I should have warned her, given her time to find another way. I didn't because the bank had protocols and I was—" He stopped. "I was a man who followed protocols. And your mother? She lost the farm, moved into Taos, into a room above a laundry, died 18 months later." His hands were very still on the table. "Not from grief," the doctor said. "Her heart had always been weak, but I know what I know." Eliza sat with this. She sat with it the way you sit with something that changes the shape of a room just by being in it. "After that, you left the bank," she said. "The week after the foreclosure completed. I took the cattle driving work because it was the most different thing I could find from sitting behind a desk with a ledger." He paused. "And then I heard about Briggs." "Tell me." "He was recruiting people who knew property law and land assessment, offering good money for information about which landowners were vulnerable in debt, in drought, facing some kind of pressure. The idea was to create conditions that made selling look like the only option, and then buy at prices that looked generous, but were well below what the land would be worth once the railroad was built." He looked at her steadily. "I worked for him for 4 months in 1884. I helped identify 3 properties. And then I saw what happened to the families on those properties, and I quit." A pause. "And then I spent the next 2 years saving money and thinking about how to make that mean something." The lamp on the table was burning low. Eliza got up and trimmed it without speaking, and when she sat back down, she looked at her partner, at this man who had paid her debt and offered her a future, and was sitting in her father's kitchen confessing to having once helped dismantle exactly the kind of life she was trying to hold on to. "You knew Briggs would come here," she said. "That's why you paid the debt when you did. Not just because of me. Because a ranch with a clear title and a legal partnership agreement is harder to pressure than a ranch in foreclosure." "Yes. You used my situation." "I used the situation that already existed," he said. "Your land was going to be taken either way. I changed the how and the who." "But you had reasons I didn't know about." "Yes." She looked at him for a long time. He didn't look away. "I need to know," she said finally. "Is there anything else? Anything that affects this ranch? This partnership that you haven't told me?" He thought about it. Genuinely. Thought she could see the care he was taking with the question. "No," he said. "That's all of it." She believed him. She wasn't entirely sure why she believed him, but she did. And she had learned to trust the instinct that had never steered her wrong with horses or with land. "All right," she said. He looked at her carefully. "All right. You did a bad thing, and then you spent years trying to figure out how to undo the damage. That doesn't make you a good man. But it makes you a man who knows the difference between good and bad, and has spent time on the right side of it." She paused. "That's more than I can say for most." He was quiet for a moment. "You're not going to trust me easily." "No, but I'm going to trust you. There's a difference." She stood picking up the coffee cups. "Get some sleep. We've got a fence line to finish tomorrow." 3 days after Briggs's visit, she found it. She had been going through the old filing box in her father's study, looking for a deed document Piton had requested, when her fingers found a folded paper tucked behind a stack of breeding records. Old. The folds gone soft with handling. The seal of the territorial bank at the top faded now to a ghost of its original blue. She unfolded it. Assessment of property, Cole Ranch, Socorro County. Assessed value: $4,200. Assessor C. Reeves. Date November 14, 1882. Her father's ranch. Caleb had assessed her father's ranch. She sat with the paper in the lamplight for a long time. Not angry, working through something more complicated than anger. He had been here. Before she had any reason to know him, before either of them could have imagined what would happen. 4 years later, he had walked through these buildings and written down numbers in a leather ledger. He had stood in her father's barn and looked at her father's horses and assigned them a value. He had not taken this ranch. Her father had been current on the loan in 1882. The assessment had been routine, not foreclosure proceedings. But Caleb Reeves had stood on this land, and she had never known, and he had been carrying that knowledge since the day he arrived. She thought about the water rights survey she had found in her pocket that day on the road to Socorro. She had shown it to him, and he had confirmed it, and she had thought that was the beginning of his accounting. But this was deeper. This was a connection she hadn't known existed. The next morning, she waited until after breakfast, until they were both in the barn, working through the morning tasks. And then she said, "I found the 1882 assessment of this ranch." He had his hands in the task of cleaning a bridle. He didn't stop working. "I wondered if you would. You knew it was there. I remembered doing it. I didn't know if your father had kept the paperwork." He paused. "It was a routine assessment. He wasn't in arrears. I just walked through the property and wrote down what I saw." "And you recognized the ranch when you came back?" "The moment I turned down the drive. I recognized the layout, the weather vane." He finished with the bridle and set it down. "I should have told you that as well." "Yes." She looked at him across the barn. "Caleb, is this place, is what you're doing here, is any of it about that assessment? About the fact that you were here in 82, and now you're here in 86, and something in between changed you?" He thought about this carefully, the way he thought about things that deserved care. "Maybe," he said. I can't fully separate the pieces. This ranch felt familiar when I came back, and familiarity isn't nothing. But that's not why I paid the debt, and it's not why I offered the partnership. He met her eyes. I offered it because your father built something worth continuing, and because you were willing to break your heart trying to keep it. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she picked up the bridle she had been meaning to repair and sat down on a hay bale and began working. Then we're square, she said. On the history. Are we? We are. She kept her hands on the work. Don't make me say it twice. 2 weeks later, the first cattle fell sick. It was subtle at first, a few animals moving slowly, not finishing their feed. Caleb caught it on an early morning round and spent the day watching the herd. By evening, 3 more animals were showing the same signs. Not dead, not dramatically ill, just wrong. This isn't disease, he said at dinner. He had that very still quality that meant he was thinking something he hadn't finished thinking yet. The symptoms don't follow a pattern, I know. And the timing. Briggs, Eliza said. He nodded slowly. I've seen it before. Something in the water or in supplemental feed. Not enough to kill outright, just enough to weaken the animals, reduce their condition. Create costs and concern. She felt something cold move through her that wasn't the November wind. He's making the ranch look like it's struggling, she said. So when he comes back with his offer, the numbers will support it. Yes. Can you prove it? Not yet. I need to know which water source they're drinking from, and I need to get a look at the feed. He paused. Jesse Colton, the young man who came by last week asking about work, is he still available? I told him we'd let him know. Hire him tomorrow. I need an extra pair of eyes on the herd and the water sources, and I need you to ride into Socorro and talk to Peyton. She looked at him. Why Peyton? Because if Briggs is doing what I think he's doing, we need legal documentation of everything from this point forward. Every incident, every dead or sick animal, every time someone comes onto this property uninvited. He was quiet for a moment. And because there's something else you need to know, and Peyton can help you find it. What? He looked at her steadily. The night before the foreclosure, I was at the saloon in Socorro. Hastings was there with a man I didn't know at the time. They were careful about it, corner table low voices. But I've spent 12 years sleeping outside with one ear open, and I can hear a conversation that's meant to be private. He paused. Hastings said he expected the Cole property to go to auction within the week. The other man said the price needed to come in under $2,000, or the acquisition costs wouldn't work. $2,000, Eliza said. The debt was $2,300, with interest and fees that Hastings had been accumulating. Deliberately, Caleb said. The original loan was at a rate that should have kept the payments manageable. The extra charges, the assessment fees, the late penalties, the administrative costs, those were added in the last 6 months, since your father died. Hastings knew. He knew about Briggs and the railroad, and he was helping manage the foreclosure timeline to get the property to auction at the right moment. That's what I believe. She sat with this for a moment. Then, what do I ask Peyton to look for? The fee structure, specifically when the additional charges were added and who authorized them. If we can show the fees were unusual, inconsistent with the bank's standard practices, in comparable cases, that's evidence of manipulation. She looked at him across the table. You know an awful lot about how banks commit fraud. I know how banks work, he said. There's unfortunately some overlap. Despite herself, despite the cold anger still moving through her, something almost like a smile pulled at her mouth. Get some sleep, Caleb. The evening she came back from Socorro with Piton's preliminary findings, a cold rain had set in. Not a hard rain, just the persistent, miserable kind that got into everything and stayed. Eliza came in through the kitchen door with water running off her coat and stopped. Caleb was at the table. He had a single piece of paper in front of him, old like everything important seemed to be, with the texture of something handled too many times. He wasn't looking at it. He was looking at the lamp flame, which meant, with whatever was on that paper long enough to stop seeing it. She took off her coat, poured herself coffee, sat down across from him. He didn't speak. She didn't ask. After a while, he turned the paper and slid it across the table toward her. She looked at it without picking it up. It was a foreclosure document. The seal of the Territorial Bank of New Mexico, a property address in Taos County, a date in 1882. The assessed value and the outstanding debt, the legal language of seizure, all of it. At the bottom, a signature. C. Reeves, authorized assessor. His mother's farm. She looked at the paper for a long time. She thought about what it meant that he had carried this document for 4 years across every cattle drive, through every season on the trail, and brought it here to this kitchen at the end of all of it. What a person kept said something true about them. She reached across the table and took the paper. She held it for a moment, feeling the age of it, the soft, worn edges. Then she got up and opened the door of the stove and put it in. The paper caught quickly. It was gone in less than 30 seconds. When she sat back down, Caleb was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, open in a way that his face didn't usually permit. Something raw around the edges. "That's not how forgiveness works," she said quietly, burning a piece of paper. "I know, but it's a start." He nodded. His jaw was working around something he wasn't going to say yet, and she understood that was all right. Some things needed time. The rain continued against the window. The fire settled in the stove. After a while, she said, "Piton found the fee irregularities. Hastings added 12 separate administrative charges to your father's account in the 6 months after he died. None of them consistent with the bank's standard fee schedule. Total additional charges $340. Caleb was quiet processing, enough to push the debt past a threshold that made it uncollectible. Piton thinks so. He's filing for an official review of the fee structure. Briggs will know about it within a week. He has someone at the bank. I expect he will." She looked at her coffee. "Then what?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain found a new angle and drove against the glass. "Then he'll do more than sick cattle," he said. "When the quiet methods stop working, he moves to louder ones." She heard what he was saying underneath the words, "Be ready." "Jesse starts Monday," she said. "Good." A pause. "Eliza." She looked up. His eyes in the lamplight were the color of winter water, gray and clear, and deep enough that she couldn't see the bottom. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the parts of this I brought with me, without telling you." She considered her answer for a moment. "You spent 4 years turning yourself into someone who would do what you did in my yard," she said finally. "That's not nothing. That's a long time to work toward one right thing." She picked up her coffee cup. "I'm glad you got here in time." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and looked away, and the night moved around them in its familiar rhythm, and they sat with what they had built so far, which was imperfect and incomplete, and true in the ways that mattered, and let it be enough for tonight. Tomorrow there would be more fence to mend, more horses to tend, more ground to defend. But tonight there was this. 3 weeks into November, Caleb said, "I need to go to Colorado." The words fell into the evening with the weight of something that had been coming for a while. They were on the porch, the cold had turned serious now, and both of them had coats on, and the last light was draining out of the western sky. "The cattle," Eliza said. She had known this was coming. "I need to settle the arrangements with the outfit holding them. Make decisions about the herd before winter settles in hard. And if we're going to have breeding stock here in the spring, I need to bring back a couple of good bulls." He paused. "I'd be gone 3 weeks, maybe 4. She looked at the darkening hills. "The mares are getting close." "Not that close. Sage is still 3-4 weeks out at minimum. I'll be back before then." He turned to look at her. "And Jesse is here. He's shaping up well." Jesse is 19. Jesse is 19 and competent, and he respects your authority completely. He'll do what you tell him." He paused. "You managed this ranch alone for 4 months before I showed up. You can manage 3 weeks. That was different." "How?" She didn't answer immediately because the honest answer was that it was different because she hadn't known then what it was like to have someone share the weight. It was different because having help had recalibrated her sense of what was bearable, and now the absence of it would be a specific thing instead of just the ordinary condition of her life. She wasn't going to say that. Not yet. "Because now there are cattle," she said. "More moving parts. Briggs will know I'm gone within a few days. It might make things easier on the ranch while I'm away, if he's watching me. Specifically, my absence reduces the target." He paused. "Or it might make him bolder. I can't know which. You think he'll try something physical?" "I think he's running out of quiet options." She looked at him. He looked at her. The evening settled around them with the particular coldness of November in New Mexico, the kind that had no apology in it. "All right," she said. "Go. But you send word when you reach Colorado." "I will." "And Caleb." He looked at her. "Come back." It was a simple thing to say, and it was also, she knew as she said it, more than a simple thing. He seemed to know it too. His expression shifted, careful and quiet, and something that belonged to the space between what people say and what they mean. "I will," he said again. The stars were coming out over the ridge. Somewhere in the barn, Ranger moved in his stall, and the weather vane turned in a shift of wind, and the Cole ranch settled into its nightly rhythms, alive, still against all reasonable odds, alive. Caleb left before dawn. Eliza did not go down to see him off. She lay in her bed and listened to the sounds of him moving through the house in the darkness, the creak of the kitchen floor where the boards had never quite settled, the specific sound of the back door, the soft thud of the barn door on its runners. Then hoofbeats moving away, growing smaller, until there was nothing left of them but the ordinary silence of a winter morning. She got up. There was no point lying in the dark, counting the ways things could go wrong. She had a ranch to run. Jesse Colton was already in the barn when she arrived, which she had not asked of him, and which told her something useful. He was 19 and rail-thin, with the eager competence of someone who had been waiting a long time for work he was suited for. He had learned quickly what she needed from him, and had the excellent quality of not requiring his ego managed while he learned it. "Morning, Miss Cole?" "Morning. How are the mares?" "Sage was restless last night. I checked on her at 3. She settled down, but she's been off her feed this morning." Eliza set down her lantern and went to Sage's stall. The mare was a bay, well built with the deep chest and strong hindquarters of her Ranger breeding beginning to show clearly, despite her advanced pregnancy. She turned her head when Eliza came in, and made the sound that was specific to her, a low, questioning noise somewhere between a whinny and a sigh. "I know," Eliza said, running her hand along the mare's neck. "I know. Not yet, though. Not for a while." She examined the mare carefully. Restless, yes. Off feed, yes. But the foal position was good, she could feel it, and the mare's temperature was normal. Not labor. Just the ordinary discomfort of the final weeks. "Keep an eye on her," she told Jesse. "Every 2 hours through the night." "Yes, ma'am." The week without Caleb was manageable. The second week was harder. The cattle that had been sickened recovered slowly, but 2 animals lost so much condition that they would need months to regain it. The fence on the south pasture was broken in 2 places, cut not broken by natural wear, the posts sheared cleanly at the base with something sharp. Jesse found boot prints in the mud nearby, but the tracks led nowhere useful. Eliza documented everything. Piton's instructions had been clear: write down the date, the time, the damage, the estimated cost. She kept a ledger of incidents the way her father had kept breeding records, meticulous, dated specific. Evidence was only evidence if it was recorded. She did not sleep well. The house had a different quality without Caleb in it, not unsafe. Nothing so dramatic as that. But larger in the way that empty spaces are larger than occupied ones. She found herself listening for sounds that were not there. Found herself turning to say something at dinner and stopping when she remembered she was alone. She had known this man for 6 weeks. 6 weeks, and the absence of him had its own specific weight. She was in the barn, working with Sage on the 18th day, when she heard it, a low, crackling sound that was wrong in a way her body understood before her mind caught up. She turned. Through the crack of the barn door, she could see orange light where orange light should not be. The feed store. The separate structure on the east side of the property, where they kept the winter hay and grain supply. It was on fire. She moved without thinking out of the barn into the cold night, running toward the burning building, while her mind catalogued rapidly what was inside: 6 months of winter hay. 2 months of grain, the reserve feed that was meant to carry the cattle through until spring. If it burned, the animals would have to be sold off, or they would starve. The ranch could not replace that much feed stock at winter prices. Jesse appeared beside her from the bunkhouse, already pulling on his coat. "The horses," she said. "Get them away from this. Now." He ran for the barn. She ran for the water pump. The fire was young, it had not yet reached the structural timber of the walls. She could see the point of origin on the south side, a concentrated burn that looked less like accident and less like lightning and more like something placed deliberately against the wall and lit. She worked the pump and dragged the hose and put water on the base of the flames while the rest of the ranch woke around her, and Jesse came out of the barn, leading horses, and the night air filled with the smell of burning hay and the sounds of frightened animals. It took 40 minutes to contain it. An hour to be sure it was out. When it was done, Eliza stood in the mud and the cold and looked at what remained. The south wall was gone. The roof had partially collapsed. They had saved perhaps 40% of the feedstock inside. Jesse came to stand beside her, ash on his coat and his hands. "Someone lit it," he said. "I know. What do we do?" She looked at the ruin of the feed store for a moment. Then she made a decision she had not known she was going to make until she made it. "You're going to ride into Socorro," she said. "Tonight. Right now. You're going to go to Arthur Patton's house, here's his address, and you're going to wake him up and tell him what happened. Tell him we need him to file an immediate complaint with the Territorial Marshal's office. Tell him I have documented evidence of a pattern of harassment going back 3 weeks. She paused. Tell him to move fast. Jesse was already moving for the horses. And you, Miss Cole? She looked back at the burned building, then at the barn, where the horses were settling, then at the dark weight of the winter sky. I'm staying here, she said, with the horses. She chose to stay. She chose the ranch over the pursuit of justice, and she chose Caleb's animals and her animals over the legal machinery that might bring Briggs down. Later she would think about that choice and recognize it for what it was the first time in her life. She had chosen a person, a living thing for a goal. She did not know that yet. That night, she only knew she was tired and cold, and her feed store was ruined, and she would not leave her horses alone in the dark. She went back into the barn and sat down in the hay near Sage's stall and waited for morning. Caleb came back on the 22nd day. He came the way he had arrived the first time, at a purposeful pace ahead of schedule, with the air of someone who has been pushing hard, because somewhere ahead of him something needed attending to. He rode in with 2 other men driving a small herd of cattle, 30 head compact and well-built, with 3 young bulls among them. Eliza was in the yard when she heard them. She set down the water bucket and stood and watched the drive come through the gate, and when she saw Caleb at the lead, She felt something release in her chest that she had not known was held. He handed off the cattle to the other riders and came toward her. His eyes were scanning her face with that careful attention he had, the kind that didn't miss things. "You're thinner," he said. "You're early. Made better time." He stopped in front of her. "What happened?" she told him. All of it: the fence, the sick cattle, the feed store. His face went very still while she talked, the particular stillness of someone absorbing information that confirms what they already suspected. When she finished, he said, "You're not hurt." "No." "The horses?" "All fine. We saved most of Sage's stall bedding by pure luck." She paused. "I sent Jesse to Peton that night. He's filed with the marshal's office." Something moved in Caleb's expression. Not surprise exactly, but something like reassessment. "You moved fast. You weren't here. I had to think for both of us." She said it without complaint, just as fact. "And the feed? We lost about 60%. I've been doing the math. If we sell 20 of the weaker cattle now, the remaining winter feed will cover the horses and the better herd through to spring." She paused. "It's not what we planned, but it works." He looked at her for a long moment, a look she was beginning to know, the one he used when something had shifted in him, and he was deciding whether to say so. "You managed it," he said. "All of it." "I said I would." "You did." A pause. "Eliza." She looked at him. He stopped, looked at his hands, then back at her. He was a man who was careful with language, who spent words the way her father had spent money, not lavishly, but when spent with intention. "I rode those last 4 hours faster than I needed to, because I wanted to get back, not just because of the ranch." The morning air was cold and still between them. "I know," she said. "I know you did." She picked up the water bucket. "Come in and eat something. Then I need to show you what I documented about the incidents. We have work to do." She walked toward the house. He followed. And that, for the moment, was enough. 2 weeks later, Harlan Briggs returned. He arrived in the same red lacquer carriage, but this time there was no cordial introduction. He climbed out of the carriage and came toward the house with a man on either side of him, not hired hands, but lawyers or men dressed to suggest lawyers. He had his face arranged in the expression of someone offering magnanimity to a defeated party. Caleb was on the porch. Something shifted in Briggs when he saw him, a brief recalibration, quickly covered. "Reeves," he said. "I wondered when you'd show up." "Mr. Briggs." Caleb's voice was flat as the winter plain. "I expect you know why I'm here. I expect you know why it won't work." Briggs's eyes moved to Eliza, who had come to stand beside Caleb on the porch. "Miss Cole, you've had a difficult season. Feed loss, livestock, illness, property damage. These things happen on a working ranch, of course, but the cumulative effect—" "Those things were done to us," Eliza said, "by someone, and we have documentation of every incident filed with the Territorial Marshal's office and with our attorney." Briggs was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his face, a calculation completing itself. "You're building a legal case," he said. "We're documenting what happened to our property," Eliza said. "If that documentation supports a legal case, that's for the marshal and the court to determine." "I see." He looked at Caleb. "You were the one who identified those properties for me back in '84. 2 ranches in Doña Ana County, 1 in Sierra. You know how this works, Reeves. You know how the territory develops. Some places grow, and some places belong to the people who built them," Caleb said. "And some men think money is the same thing as the right to take what other people built. It isn't." Briggs looked between them with the expression of someone who is recalibrating toward a harder approach. "The offer stands. 60 days, as I said. Think carefully." He turned and walked back to his carriage. When the sound of wheels had faded down the drive, Eliza said quietly, "He's not done." "No," Caleb agreed. He's going to try the law instead of the fire. His lawyers will look for any legal weakness in our position, the partnership agreement, the title, anything. Peyton has everything. I know, but Peyton needs to know about the 1884 work I did for Briggs. That's leverage Briggs might use against me if this gets to a courtroom. She turned to look at him. You're prepared to say it publicly in court if it comes to that. If it comes to that. His jaw was set. I'm not going to let him use my past as a weapon against this ranch. If I say it first in the right context, it becomes something different than if he says it about me. It becomes accountability instead of accusation, she said. Yes. He paused. You understand what it could do to the partnership's reputation. If people know I used to work for the bank, used to work for Briggs. People know what they see, Eliza said. They see a ranch that was about to fail that's still standing. They see livestock being cared for and fences being mended. They see us here working. She looked at him steadily. Let them know about the past. What they'll remember is the present. He looked at her. He had that open expression again, the one she had seen only twice before. You're braver than I am, he said. I'm not. I'm just not carrying anything I need to hide. She paused. Not anymore. The trial came in February. It was not a grand legal proceeding. The territory ran to the practical, and the Socorro courthouse was a modest building with a pot-bellied stove and wooden benches worn smooth by years of difficult decisions. But it was real and public, and the town came out for it with the attentiveness of people who understood that what was decided here would echo beyond the immediate question. Peyton had built the case carefully. The fee irregularities, Hastings' deliberate accumulation of unauthorized charges to manufacture an unpayable debt. The pattern of harassment, the documented incidents, each one individually deniable, collectively damning. The connection to Briggs demonstrated through financial records that Peyton had obtained through the court's discovery process, showing the payments from Briggs's Denver accounts to Hastings in the months preceding the foreclosure attempt. Hastings' lawyers tried 3 strategies in sequence. First, that the fee charges were standard practice. Peyton produced comparable cases that showed they were not. Second, that the ranch incidents were accidental. The marshal's office had by this point found evidence of the man Briggs had paid to start the fire. Third, and this was the one Eliza had been waiting for, that Caleb Reeves was a compromised witness, having worked both for the bank and for Briggs, and that his testimony on behalf of the partnership should be dismissed. Caleb was called to the stand on the second day of the proceeding. Eliza sat in the second row and watched him walk to the witness chair. He moved with his ordinary economy, no performance, no bracing for impact. He sat down and looked at the judge and waited. Peyton led him through the factual narrative first. The payment of the debt, the partnership agreement, the cattle operation, the documentation of incident. Caleb answered in the same even voice he used for everything direct, precise, without elaboration. Then Briggs's lawyer stood. He was a man from Denver, imported for the occasion, with the practiced confidence of someone who had done this many times in larger courts than this one. He established Caleb's history with the bank. Established the 4 months in 1884. Established methodically that Caleb Reeves had once helped Harlan Briggs identify vulnerable properties for acquisition. So you were working for Mr. Briggs, the lawyer said, while also claiming to be protecting the coal ranch from him. No, Caleb said. I left Mr. Briggs' employ in August of 1884. I arrived at the coal ranch in October of 1886. Those events are separated by more than 2 years. During which time you conveniently developed a concern for the kind of ranching families you had previously helped to dispossess. During which time I worked cattle drives from Colorado to Texas, Caleb said, and thought about whether the work I had done in my 20s was the man I wanted to be for the rest of my life. A pause. And before your time with Mr. Briggs, the lawyer continued, you worked as a bank assessor, assessing properties for foreclosure proceedings. Yes. Including properties belonging to your own family. The courtroom was very quiet. Eliza did not move. Yes, Caleb said. His voice did not change. You signed the foreclosure paperwork for your own mother's farm. I did. Still the same voice. Not defended. Not ashamed, just present with it the way you are present with a truth that has had time to become yours. I was 26 years old, and I had been trained to follow protocols, and following protocols was easier than making a different choice. My mother lost her farm. She died 18 months later. I have spent the years since then considering what my choices cost her. Very moving, the lawyer said, and yet the court is supposed to believe that this man who helped a bank take his own mother's land, who helped a developer identify vulnerable families to dispossess, suddenly developed a conscience and arrived at the Cole Ranch as a savior. I didn't arrive as a savior, Caleb said. I arrived as someone who had money. I'd been saving for land, and an opportunity to use it in a way that might, in some small measure, be worth more than just buying acreage. Whether that constitutes a conscience or not, I can't say. The court can make its own determination. Silence. The lawyer tried 2 more angles. Caleb answered both of them with the same quality, not combative, not evasive, simply present with whatever was true and willing to say it. When it was done, Peyton rose for redirect. Mr. Reeves, he said, the defense has suggested that your history with the bank and with Mr. Briggs makes your testimony unreliable. I'd like to ask you about something else. The documentation presented in evidence the ledger of incidents, the fee analysis, the correspondence with the marshal's office. Who prepared those records? Miss Cole prepared them, my partner. From the beginning, from the night of the feed store fire, she sent Jesse Colton to wake me up at 2 a.m. to file the initial report. And the fee analysis. She found the initial discrepancy while reviewing the old loan documents. She brought it to Peyton. The original identification of Mr. Briggs's interest in the railroad corridor. That was mine, but the documentation establishing the connection to the bank was assembled by Miss Cole and Mr. Peyton, working from public records. Peyton looked at the judge. The integrity of this case rests not on the prior history of Mr. Reeves, but on a body of documented evidence assembled methodically by the plaintiff and her counsel. The defense has offered no counter-evidence to that documentation, no explanation for the unauthorized fee charges, no accounting for the money that traveled from Mr. Briggs' accounts to Mr. Hastings, no alternative interpretation of the physical evidence at the fire site. He paused. The past of one witness does not erase a record. The verdict came on the 3rd day. Hastings was found liable for breach of fiduciary duty and fraudulent fee assessment. The court ordered full restitution of the $340 in improper charges plus damages. Briggs was found liable for the harassment campaign, and the fire and his property acquisition plans in the corridor were suspended, pending a full investigation by the territorial government. It was not everything. Briggs had lawyers who would appeal, and the railroad question would take years to fully resolve. But it was enough. It was the declaration that the Cole Ranch belonged to the people who had built it, and that declaration was now written into the legal record. Outside the courthouse in the February cold, Eliza stood on the steps and looked at the Socorro Street, and felt the particular exhausted satisfaction of a battle that had gone on long enough that its ending was almost surprising. Caleb came to stand beside her. They didn't speak for a while. Around them, people moved on with their days, and the normal life of the town continued, and the story that had consumed her for 4 months receded into the background hum of a decision already made. "It'll come up again," Caleb said. "The railroad question. Briggs isn't finished. I know. But we'll have more time, and more documentation. Yes. She looked at him. You told the truth in there. All of it. You knew what it might cost. He was quiet for a moment. It cost less than I expected, because you said it before they could use it against you. Because you made it yours. Maybe. He glanced at her. Or because a person's past matters less in a community than what they do with the time they're given. That's what Jack Morrison told me when he stopped by the ranch last month. Morrison's a sensible man. He said he'd worked cattle with me 6 years ago in Colorado, said I was honest, said the town could do worse than take his word for it. Eliza smiled a real smile, the kind that had been in short supply since October. Who knew that reputation was currency? Your father seemed to understand it. The breeding records, the letters of recommendation. He spent 30 years building something that people knew had value. And we're building on top of it. She turned to face the street. Caleb, there's something I want to say. All right. She took a breath of the cold February air. I've been thinking about what you said. In October, before the foreclosure. You said you'd been watching the ranch for 2 months learning about the situation. You came prepared. Yes. And I've been thinking about what I would have said to that, if I'd known it at the time. Whether I would have been angry that you had information about me that I didn't know you had. He was very still. I think I would have been angry, she said. And I think that anger would have been wrong. Not because it isn't strange to be known before you know someone, but because the question isn't how you came to care. The question is what you do with caring. She paused. You could have used what you knew about this ranch's vulnerability to buy the land at auction for less than it was worth. That would have been easier. That would have been the bank's way, Briggs's way. She looked at him directly. You didn't do that. No. You paid more than the land was worth in the way that mattered. And then you stayed. He looked at her, and she looked back, and they were 2 people standing on a courthouse step in February, having the most consequential conversation they had ever had. And it was not romantic by any conventional measure, and it was the most honest thing she had ever done. I'm glad you stayed, she said, and I want you to know that I have stopped being afraid of saying that. That it took me a while, but I'm done being afraid of it. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Eliza. Yes. Is this the part where I ask you something? Her breath made a small cloud in the cold air. I think it might be. Then I'm asking. He met her eyes. Not because it's practical. Not because of the ranch, or the partnership, or any other reason that could be written in a document. Because somewhere between October and now, I have become a man who cannot imagine building what we're building with anyone other than you. He paused. Will you marry me? It was not quite a question. It was the kind of statement that had grown too large to be contained by a question mark. She said, yes. She said it the way she had said yes to the partnership with full knowledge of what it cost and clear sight of what it was worth, not fearlessly, with both eyes open. He reached out and took her hand, right there on the courthouse step in the February cold, in front of whoever was passing and whoever might be watching, and the whole unfussy, unceremonious real world. She let him. They were married in March in the parlor of the ranch house, with Piton and Jesse as witnesses. Caleb's leg had been undamaged. It was his left shoulder that carried the burn scar from the night of the fire, the skin there still tender at the edges when the cold got into it. He moved through the small ceremony without crutches, without difficulty upright in the way of a man who has arrived at exactly the place he intended to reach. Eliza wore her mother's dress. It had taken a week to alter it properly, and when she put it on the morning of the ceremony, she stood in front of the small mirror in her parents' room, and looked at her own face and thought, I am the age she was when she married him. She thought, I am not her. I will love the way she loved, and I will not disappear into it. She thought. He would not want me to. The vows were brief. Jessie cried, which nobody acknowledged. Peyton shook both their hands afterward, with the grave satisfaction of a man who had helped make a thing legally sound, and found it had turned out to be more than that. Afterward, in the kitchen, with coffee and the spare wedding dinner Eliza had made because there had been no time for anything elaborate, Jessie raised his cup and said, "To the Hartley Mercer Ranch," and stopped embarrassed. "I mean the Cole Reeves Ranch. I don't know." "To the ranch," Caleb said, simply. And they drank to that. Spring arrived and rewrote everything. The hills turned green in the way they do after a hard winter, not gradually, but suddenly, as if the land had been holding its breath, and finally let go. The cattle grew fat on new grass. The horses ran in the pastures with an abandon that was its own kind of joy. Sage's foal came in March, 2 weeks after the wedding. A filly dark bay with a perfect star on her forehead, and the deep chest of her father, and the intelligent eye of her dam. She was on her feet within an hour, nursing with the vigorous certainty of a creature that has never known a world that wasn't sufficient. They named her Hope. Eliza stood in the stall and watched the filly discover her own legs, and felt something complete itself in her chest, some long-held equation finally resolving. This was what her father had been working toward. This was the horse he had been breeding when the world interrupted him. She had not saved it unchanged. She had saved it, and changed it, and made it into something he would have recognized and been proud of. Not just survival, she thought. Thriving. In the evening, she and Caleb stood at the fence of the pasture and watched the light drain out of the sky and the first stars appear above the ridge. The sounds of the ranch moved around them, the cattle settling the horses quiet now after the day's exertion somewhere in the barn, the new filly nursing. "She's going to be extraordinary," Caleb said. "She already is." Eliza leaned on the fence rail. "Papa would have said she's the proof of the work." What would he say about the rest of it? She considered. He would have liked you. Eventually. After he'd made you uncomfortable with questions for about 3 weeks. She paused. He was a fair man. He judged by what he saw over time. "I hope to earn that. You already have. By the standard of the only person who matters." She glanced at him. Me. He looked at her with that expression she had come to love, the one where something warm came through the habitual reserve of him like light through a crack in a door. "Eliza," he said. "Yes. I want to change the ranch name, formally, make it official." He paused. "Cole Reeves, both names on the deed, so it's clear what this is." She was quiet for a moment. Her father's name, her name joined to his. The deed that had been Thomas Cole's, then hers, then theirs. "It should be Cole first," she said, "because that's where it started." "Cole first," he agreed. "Then yes." She pushed off the fence. "Come inside. I made dinner." She walked back toward the house her father had built, and she had kept, and they had built onto together board by board, in the way of people making a permanent thing. Behind her, she heard Caleb follow, and behind him the ranch went on doing what it had always done, what she would spend the rest of her life helping it do. Living. On an afternoon in April, Eliza went up the hill to the iron fence. She went alone. It was the kind of morning that asks nothing of you. Soft light, a wind that was almost warm. The hills so green after the long winter that they seemed almost impossible. She stood at the gate and looked at the 2 stones. Thomas Cole, 1821 to 1886. Margaret Cole, 1825 to 1886. "I brought someone," she said. "He's not here right now, he's down mending the south fence, but I wanted to tell you about him." The wind moved through the cedar tree. "His name is Caleb. He rode onto the ranch in October when the bank was taking everything, and he paid the debt, and when I asked him why, he said he had money, and he knew what it was to watch someone lose everything." She paused. "That wasn't the whole truth. I know that now. The whole truth is more complicated, but he told me the rest of it when I needed to know. A hawk moved overhead, drawing a slow circle against the sky. He's not easy, Mama. He's quiet in a way that you have to learn to read. He carried something heavy for a long time, and he's still setting it down. But he works like he means it, and he tells me the truth, and he stays. She paused. He stays. Her voice was steady. She had practiced being steady. Papa, I think you would have approved of him. Eventually. After you'd watched him work for a season and seen that he knows horses better than he lets on. After you'd had a poker game with him and realized he plays honestly, even when he doesn't have to. She stopped. He's good at the things that matter. The light shifted on the ridge, and the ranch below her was alive with the ordinary noise of a working day. Jesse's voice from somewhere near the barn, the sound of cattle moving the distant rhythm of hammering where Caleb was working on the fence. I wanted you to know, Eliza said. I wanted to say I'm all right. I'm more than all right. And she put her hand on the iron gate for a moment, feeling the cold of it. I'm going to keep building it. What you started. We're going to keep building it. She stood there a little longer in the April light with her parents beneath the ground, and her husband on the land they had made, and the whole green, improbable future spreading out in every direction. Then she turned and walked back down the hill. Halfway down, she could see Caleb. He had stopped his fence work and turned to watch her descend, one hand up to shade his eyes against the light. He didn't call out to her, just watched with that steady quality that was his most consistent thing, the watchfulness of a man who knows what he values and pays attention to it. She raised her hand when she saw him looking. He raised his. She kept walking. The Cole Reeves ranch spread out around her in the New Mexico spring under the wide sky, alive with the ordinary, extraordinary work of people who had decided to stay, who had looked at hard ground and hard seasons, and the particular difficulty of trusting another person with the things that mattered, and had decided anyway. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, everything.